March 23, 1943, near El Getar, Tunisia. The air was thick with dust and cordite. Burned-out tanks littered the desert valley, metal carcasses of war half buried in sand. The smell of oil and scorched rubber hung heavy over the battlefield. Corporal Franz Mertens of the 10th Panzer Division crouched behind a half-track, watching smoke rise from what had once been a proud column of German armor. The Americans had hit them harder than expected that morning, and their lines were now crawling with U.S. Shermans pushing forward, guns blazing. A shell whistled past, landing somewhere behind him with a deafening thud. Franz pressed his helmet down and muttered, "Verdammt, that's another Panzer gone." He turned toward a crippled Panzer IV, its right track torn off by artillery. The crew had bailed moments ago, one of them limping, his uniform blackened by smoke. They'd have to abandon it. Again. For the Germans in North Africa, losing a tank didn't just mean losing a machine. It meant watching weeks of engineering, manpower, and steel vanish into the sand. There was no saving a crippled Panzer. Once hit, it was gone for good. The logistics lines back to Europe were stretched thin, and recovery vehicles were rare. If a tank broke down or lost its track, crews often set it ablaze to keep it from enemy hands. As the gunfire faded that evening, Franz peered through his binoculars at the distant American lines. To his surprise, U.S. soldiers were already dragging damaged Shermans off the battlefield with thick steel cables. At first, he thought they were salvaging them for scrap. But the next morning, those same Shermans, blackened, patched, and belching smoke, rolled back into formation, guns pointed once again toward the German line. Franz couldn't believe what he was seeing. Those tanks were burning yesterday. Now they were back, ready for combat. He turned to his lieutenant, stunned. How is this possible? They fixed them. Here in the desert? Lieutenant Weber squinted, his face grimy and sunburnt. They must have workshops nearby, mobile ones. He spat into the sand. Americans don't fight the same war we do. What Franz didn't know was that behind those Sherman lines, entire mobile repair battalions were working around the clock. Massive convoys of trucks, cranes, and mechanics operating like a traveling factory. Every tank had a lifeline. Every damaged machine had a chance to fight again. As night fell over the desert, German troops scavenged what they could from their ruined armor. Machine guns, radios, spare treads. The wrecks would be left behind for good. But on the other side of the battlefield, the Americans were pulling miracles out of the dust. Sparks flew from welding torches. Engines were being hoisted out of hulls by cranes. Mechanics in greasy overalls worked under floodlights, their hands black with oil. By dawn, the German positions heard the unmistakable rumble of engines, American engines. The same Shermans that had been crippled yesterday were now back in line, advancing again. Franz lowered his binoculars, disbelief in his eyes. "They fix them faster than we can destroy them," he whispered. For the first time, he felt something colder than fear. He felt inevitability, because this wasn't just a battle of courage or tactics anymore. It was a battle of machines, and the Americans had found a way to keep theirs alive. March 24th, 1943, just behind the front lines of El Getar, Tunisia. The desert was quiet, save for the low hum of engines and the occasional clang of metal. Rows of Shermans sat in neat formation, their armor scarred but their guns polished and ready. Here, the true secret of American warfare revealed itself, not in the tactics or firepower, but in the ingenuity of men working tirelessly to defy the chaos of combat. Sergeant James "Jimmy" O'Connor wiped sweat from his brow as he crouched over a Sherman whose turret had been blown off the day before. Sparks flew from the welders' torches as a crew of mechanics, barely out of their teens, replaced gears, welded fractured plates, and refilled damaged fuel lines. Each tank had a dedicated team, rotating in shifts, working under the harsh sun and the ever-present threat of artillery shells from the German lines. Jimmy leaned close to the engine compartment. "Keep it steady," he barked to Private Daniels, who was balancing on the hull like a tightrope walker. The engine roared to life with a cough and a shudder. A cheer went up from the mechanics' crew. They didn't just fix tanks, they resurrected them. Meanwhile, the Germans on the ridge above could only stare. Captain Dieter Klein, a Panzer officer, had climbed a small dune for a better vantage point. Through his binoculars, he saw Sherman after Sherman roll back into position. He counted at least 5 tanks that had been destroyed the day before. "Impossible," he muttered. "They are ghosts." The Americans had perfected a system of rapid battlefield recovery. If a Sherman was disabled, Recovery teams would move in with M32 armored recovery vehicles. They would haul the tank to the nearest mobile workshop, where engineers, welders, and machinists operated as one well-oiled machine. Tracks could be replaced in under an hour. Engines swapped in less than 4. Even turrets, once thought destroyed, were removed, repaired, and reinstalled with astonishing speed. In one corner, Corporal O'Malley tightened a set of bolts on a Sherman that had taken a direct hit from a German 88mm. He glanced at the blackened hole in the side and muttered, "She'll take another round, no problem." Across the yard, Private Hernandez was rewiring radios, ensuring the tank commander could communicate with the unit. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. For the Germans, this was more than frustration. It was demoralization. In their experience, a lost tank meant weeks or even months of waiting for replacement armor. Entire strategies had been abandoned because their mechanized units were stranded, waiting for supplies that never came fast enough. The Americans, on the other hand, seemed to fight on 2 fronts at once, one in the field and one behind the lines, where steel, sweat, and ingenuity made the impossible routine. Captain Klein lowered his binoculars, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. "Our Panzer IVs are fragile compared to these monsters," he muttered, thinking of the crews who had abandoned their vehicles. "Even the ones that survive, they can't be returned to battle like that." And that was the cruel irony. German tanks could be terrifying when operational, but their rigidity and logistical vulnerabilities made them liabilities when damaged. American Shermans, weaker on paper, had an invisible advantage. They could come back from the dead, over and over again. By late afternoon, Franz Mertens and his comrades retreated to a small ridge to regroup. The sight below shook them. A full American tank platoon, once thought destroyed, was forming a line once again, advancing toward their positions as if nothing had happened. Franz swallowed hard, feeling the chill of realization. The desert battlefield had become a machine-powered resurrection ground, and he was watching the future of armored warfare unfold in real time. March 25, 1943, El Getar, Tunisia. Franz Mertens squinted against the rising sun, his eyes tracing the line of advancing Shermans. Each tank, blackened from previous battles, seemed almost alive, a mechanical beast that refused to die. Around him, German soldiers whispered in disbelief. Even seasoned officers exchanged uneasy glances. The desert, usually a silent witness to destruction, now echoed with the low rumble of resurrected machinery. Lieutenant Weber tightened his grip on his binoculars. "It's unnatural," he said, voice low. "They should be out of the fight by now, yet here they come, again." Across the battlefield, American mechanics continued their work, moving like shadows between tanks. Portable cranes lifted shattered turrets, welders patched gaping holes in the hulls, and teams of drivers tested engines, restarting each machine as if performing a ritual of rebirth. Some German soldiers shook their heads, unable to comprehend the scale of the operation. Corporal Mertens recalled the last engagement near Kasserine Pass. Back then, a single artillery hit or anti-tank mine could render a panzer useless for weeks. The Germans had no choice but to abandon their pride, leaving tanks in the sand as tombstones. Now, he saw the Americans treating destruction not as an end, but as a temporary setback. From his vantage point, Franz noticed something even more unnerving. Sherman tanks that had been hit by direct 75mm rounds were moving again. Their turrets rotated, their guns trained steadily. Tracks, replaced mere hours before, gripped the sand as if nothing had happened. Engineers and mechanics disappeared into the shadows of tanks, only to emerge with another machine ready for battle. This is not warfare we know," muttered Private Schreiber, a young panzer gunner. "It's something else, like they have magic in their hands." But it wasn't magic. It was industrial efficiency combined with human ingenuity. Each Sherman had a mobile repair team in close proximity, trained to respond immediately. They could salvage engines, replace tracks, repair radios, and even patch armor, all while under the threat of enemy fire. By contrast, the Germans relied on long supply lines stretching back to Tunisia's ports and into Europe. A damaged panzer could easily sit idle for days, sometimes weeks, while the crew waited for parts that might never arrive. As the day wore on, skirmishes flared. The Germans tried to halt the advancing Shermans with artillery and anti-tank guns. Shells hit the tanks, tore open armor, and sent clouds of dust into the air. But when the smoke cleared, the Americans weren't gone. They had pulled back briefly, yes, but within hours, damaged tanks returned to the front, welded and repaired, engines humming, ready to fight again. Franz felt a growing sense of dread. The battle wasn't just about numbers or firepower anymore. It was about sustainability, about resilience. The Germans had underestimated the speed at which the Americans could recover, repair, and redeploy their machines. Every tank they destroyed yesterday could be back today and tomorrow and the day after that. Captain Klein finally broke the silence, voice taut with disbelief. If they can keep this up, we are doomed to fight ghosts, machines that refuse to die, men who refuse to rest. He looked out over the desert, realizing the scale of the challenge. The war wasn't just on the battlefield. It was being waged in workshops, in the hands of engineers, in the meticulous care of mechanics. And in that desert, the Americans had already mastered it. March 26, 1943. A hidden sand ridge just behind the American front lines at El Guitar. The desert air was filled with the scent of fuel, welding smoke, and scorched metal. Inside the American Mobile Workshop, Staff Sergeant Henry Hank Thompson moved with precise urgency, checking the assembly line of damaged Shermans. The workshop wasn't a building. It was a convoy of trucks, cranes, and makeshift shelters, all strategically positioned to repair tanks mere hours after they had been hit. Private First Class Eddie Collins adjusted a turret alignment while a welder behind him repaired a cracked hull. Sparks flew with every strike of the torch, illuminating the faces of mechanics streaked with grime and sweat. Come on, Hank barked, adjusting the hoist. We've got a line of tanks waiting outside. The boys need these on the field by nightfall. In one corner, a Sherman that had lost an entire track yesterday was now rolling smoothly. Engine replaced, hydraulics fixed, turret reinstalled. A crew of 5 men climbed in and ran diagnostic checks. Each tank was treated as if it were a living soldier. Every bolt, every cable, every gear accounted for. Meanwhile, back on the ridge, German observers watched in growing horror. Franz Mertens could see the small figures moving among the tanks, welding, lifting, repairing, and within hours, the very machines they had assumed destroyed were moving again. Captain Klein's jaw tightened. "It's an assembly line of resurrection," he muttered. "We can kill their tanks, but we cannot kill their work ethic." Hank Thompson paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked over his crew. "Remember, boys," he said, "every tank you get back out there is another inch we push into enemy territory. Keep it tight. Keep it fast. Lives depend on these machines." It wasn't just speed, it was ingenuity. The Americans had developed specialized tools for rapid repair. Modular track sections, prefabricated turret plates, and hydraulic lifts that allowed an entire engine to be swapped in less than 4 hours. Fuel lines were pre-tested, electrical wiring labeled for immediate reconnection, and spare parts cataloged meticulously. Each tank had a rescue protocol, a step-by-step guide that allowed even a partially trained crew to restore it to battle readiness. The Germans had nothing like this. A Panzer IV or Panther struck in combat might be immobilized for days. Even minor damage could render it useless. And when it came to artillery or airstrikes, there was often no hope at all. American Shermans, in contrast, were never truly dead. They were merely wounded, and the workshop crews were the battlefield surgeons. By late afternoon, the results spoke for themselves. A platoon of Shermans, some with armor pockmarked by direct hits from German 88mm guns, rumbled past the workshops and back toward the front line. Franz and his fellow German soldiers watched in stunned silence as the tanks rejoined the battle. Some even noted the subtle improvements: patched armor, reinforced tracks, and engines humming stronger than before. "Every tank we destroy comes back stronger," muttered Private Schreiber, voice barely audible over the rumble of engines. How do you fight that? For the Germans, the answer was terrifyingly clear. They couldn't. Not if the Americans could maintain this pace, this precision, and this relentless cycle of destruction and resurrection. March 27, 1943, the shifting sands around El Guitar. By mid-morning, the German forces began to notice a worrying pattern. No matter how many Shermans they disabled, or how many artillery shells tore into American ranks, the tanks seemed inexhaustible. Franz Mertens crouched behind a ridge with his comrades, scanning the battlefield. Smoke from previous engagements still rose from craters, but among the plumes moved the unmistakable shapes of repaired Shermans, each engine humming a defiant note against the chaos of war. Lieutenant Weber's voice was tight with frustration. They're impossible to stop. Even when we knock one down, another appears in its place. Every hour we hold them back, they come back stronger. He spat into the dust, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his binoculars. On the American side, Sergeant Hank Thompson was coordinating repairs with military precision. The workshops had become a well-oiled machine, one crew focused on engines, another on tracks, another on armor and turrets. A single damaged Sherman could be fully operational again in less than 8 hours, sometimes even faster if the damage was limited. The Germans didn't just see a single Sherman back in action. They saw platoons restored overnight, a force that refused to diminish. Franz watched, disbelief etched across his face as one repaired tank rolled forward, engaging a German position that had been certain of victory just the day before. The crew inside the Sherman worked in near-perfect synchronization. They fired with calculated precision, coordinated their movements, and retreated when necessary, then were immediately replaced by another tank, repaired and ready by the Americans. "What kind of war is this?" muttered Private Schreiber, gripping his rifle as he tried to keep pace with the crumbling German defense line. "Every tank we destroy comes back. Every strike we make, they recover." The stark contrast between the two sides became undeniable. German panzer divisions, proud and feared across Europe and North Africa, had been conditioned to respect armored warfare. But they had never faced an opponent whose mechanical resilience exceeded their own fighting spirit. The Americans weren't merely fighting, they were enduring, repairing, and returning stronger than before. By late afternoon, Captain Klein gathered his officers. Maps were spread across the hood of a half-track, annotated with the locations of destroyed tanks and recent American movements. "Gentlemen," he began, voice grave, "this is no ordinary battle. Every tank we destroy, every offensive we launch, is undone by their efficiency. Our panzer divisions are limited. Their Shermans, they are endless." Franz Mertens felt a sinking realization. The desert no longer seemed like a neutral ground. It had become a proving field, not of German superiority, but of American ingenuity and persistence. The Germans could win a skirmish, yes, but they could never truly win the engagement if the Americans could continuously return their damaged tanks to the fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battered desert, the sound of Sherman engines echoed in the distance. Each rumble carried with it a warning that Franz and his comrades could not ignore. This was the new face of armored warfare, relentless, adaptive, and terrifyingly resilient. March 28, 1943. Evening, El Guetar, Tunisia. The battlefield was quiet now, but the silence was heavy with tension. German soldiers trudged through sand-strewn trenches, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, minds racing with the day's impossible events. Franz Mertens sank onto a rock, exhausted yet unable to shake the image of repaired Shermans rolling across the desert, machines that should have been destroyed days ago. Around him, his fellow soldiers shared the same disbelief, a growing sense of futility settling over their ranks. Captain Klein approached, his uniform caked in dust, eyes hollow from witnessing what he could only describe as mechanical sorcery. "We cannot fight like this," he admitted, almost to himself. "Every attack we make, every tank we destroy, they return. It's as if the desert itself rebuilds them." He clenched his fists, the realization bitter and cold. "Our logistics cannot match theirs. Our panzers are fragile in comparison. We're fighting ghosts. We're gnolls." Meanwhile, behind the front lines, the American mobile workshops hummed with life, indifferent to the German despair. Sergeant Hank Thompson walked between tanks, his voice carrying encouragement. "Good work, men. That Sherman over there, it'll see action again tonight. Keep it up." And we keep moving forward. The mechanics' hands were black with grease, but their eyes sparkled with purpose. Each repaired tank was more than steel. It was a statement, a promise that the Americans could endure, adapt, and overcome. Franz watched a Sherman roll past, its turret swiveling smoothly, its engine purring. He realized something fundamental. This was more than a battle of tactics or bravery. The Americans had built an army that refused to diminish. Even their losses were temporary. Every tank, every vehicle that fell to German fire could be resurrected. In the desert, speed and firepower mattered, but so did endurance. And on that day, endurance belonged to the Americans. Lieutenant Weber lowered his binoculars, jaw tight. "We fight hard," he said, voice grim, "but they repair harder. We destroy, and they rebuild." His words carried the weight of a terrifying truth. German victories could be fleeting, while American persistence turned the tide slowly but inexorably. Night fell, and the desert stretched into shadows and uncertainty. German soldiers huddled around small fires, whispering stories of tanks that should have been dead but weren't. Franz stared into the darkness, imagining the relentless hum of engines in the sand, the sparks of welding torches, the hands of mechanics who refused to let their machines die. Somewhere in the distance, a Sherman fired its main gun, signaling that the fight was far from over. Franz understood now. The war wasn't just fought with guns and tactics. It was fought with ingenuity, with the tireless hands of men who could turn destruction into resurrection. And in that realization lay a fear deeper than any artillery shell. A fear that no matter how many tanks they destroyed, the Americans would always have more ready to fight. For the Germans, Tunisia had become a proving ground, not for their supremacy, but for the Americans' relentless efficiency. And Franz Mertens, like many of his comrades, knew that this lesson would haunt them long after the desert winds had swept away the last traces of smoke and sand. March 29, 1943. Dawn breaks over the desert battlefield of El Gaitar. The sand shimmered with the early morning light, revealing the scars of previous engagements, craters, discarded equipment, and the occasional skeletal frame of a Panzer left behind. But the Americans, as usual, were already moving. Sherman tanks, some patched with makeshift armor plates and freshly replaced treads, rumbled forward. Mechanics in dusty overalls followed closely behind, ready to repair any tank that faltered. This scene, repeated day after day, would forever redefine the German soldiers' understanding of armored warfare. Franz Mertens stood atop a small ridge, binoculars in hand, taking in the sight. He had fought in countless battles, yet nothing had prepared him for this. Every destroyed tank returned. Every setback was temporary. It was not just a matter of production or supply, it was a system, a philosophy. The Americans had turned repair and recovery into an integral part of their combat strategy, something the Germans had never fully grasped. In Europe, German tank doctrine emphasized engineering superiority, armor thickness, and concentrated firepower. Mobility was important, but only if the machine remained operational. When a Panzer was damaged, it often meant weeks away from combat, or permanent loss. The desert, Franz realized, had exposed a vulnerability that extended beyond Tunisia. Germany could not match the Americans' logistical ingenuity. Meanwhile, in the American mobile workshops, Sergeant Hank Thompson watched as a newly repaired Sherman was inspected and driven back into formation. "Another one ready," he called to his crew, a note of pride in his voice. "That's 10 tanks back in the fight this week. Keep it rolling, boys. Keep it rolling." The emphasis on continuous repair, speed, and efficiency wasn't just a tactic. It was a strategic advantage that allowed the Americans to sustain armored offensives that would otherwise have faltered. The Germans were forced to adapt, but their options were limited. They could increase production, but their factories could not keep pace with the Americans. They could improve logistics, but supply lines stretched across hostile territory were vulnerable to disruption. And so, in the heart of the Tunisian desert, Franz and his fellow soldiers learned a bitter lesson. War was not won solely by firepower, courage, or tactics. It was also won by the ability to endure, to repair, and to rise again, machine after machine. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows over the sand, the battlefield had become a living testament to American resilience. Each Sherman that returned to the fight carried not only metal and guns, but the spirit of ingenuity, determination, and relentless persistence. Franz Mertens and the German soldiers understood now that facing these machines was not merely a tactical challenge. It was a psychological trial. Every engine that roared back to life reminded them that in this new era of armored warfare, destruction was never final, and victory was never guaranteed. The desert winds swept across the battlefield, carrying with them the scent of oil and burnt metal, a reminder that the war had evolved. The Germans had once believed that their superior engineering and armored prowess would dominate the battlefield, but now, in the shadow of the American Shermans and their tireless mechanics, a new reality had been cemented. In the war of machines, resilience could be just as deadly as firepower. And in that moment, Franz Mertens realized the true scale of the challenge ahead. The Americans would not simply fight. They would endure, repair, and return stronger, time and again, until the desert itself could no longer hold them back. March 30th, 1943. Nightfall over El Gaitar, Tunisia. The battlefield had quieted again, the sun replaced by a cold, star-strewn sky. German soldiers huddled in their makeshift camps, exhaustion etched into every line of their faces. Franz Mertens stared at the horizon where the silhouettes of repaired Shermans lingered, their engines idling softly, like beasts waiting patiently to strike again. He thought back to the first time he had seen them roll back onto the battlefield, smoky, battered, yet fully functional. The memory burned into his mind, a revelation that the war was no longer just a clash of guns and courage. It was a war of endurance, speed, and ingenuity. Captain Klein sat beside him, rubbing his jaw. "We've underestimated them," he said quietly. "Not just their numbers, not just their weapons, but the way they fight. They treat every tank as if it has a second life, a third life, and it terrifies me." For Franz, the lessons were profound. The Americans had demonstrated that destruction was not necessarily final. Their mobile workshops, their disciplined crews, and their relentless repair efforts allowed them to sustain armored combat in a way the Germans had never encountered. Where the Germans abandoned damaged panzers to the sands, the Americans resurrected their Shermans in hours, turning temporary setbacks into continued assaults. The impact went beyond the immediate battlefield. This approach reshaped the very strategy of armored warfare. For the Germans, it was a bitter acknowledgement that superior firepower alone could not guarantee victory. Tactical brilliance needed to be paired with logistics, innovation, and rapid recovery, a combination the Americans had mastered. In the weeks and months that followed, these lessons echoed across battlefields worldwide. Shermans that were repaired and returned to action contributed to the eventual success of the Allied campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and beyond. Mechanized warfare evolved, with the idea that no machine should be permanently lost if it could be salvaged, a principle that would carry into armored doctrines for decades to come. Franz Mertens looked up at the stars, the desert silent, except for the occasional hum of a distant engine. He realized that, though the Germans had fought bravely, they had faced an opponent who had redefined endurance itself. In that quiet night, he understood a truth that would stay with him long after the war. In modern warfare, the ability to recover and persist could be as decisive as the ability to strike. And in the shifting sands of Tunisia, amid the smoke, oil, and metal, the Shermans continued to roll. Proof that ingenuity, discipline, and relentless repair could turn the tide of battle, shock an enemy, and leave a lasting legacy that would echo through military history.